Well, I think part of the issue is the effect and the magnitude and the speed of which that hurricane came at us. It started out in the Gulf, and then they said it may grow, and then it did grow, and then it may grow a little more, and then it really grew. Within a 3-day period, we ended up with a Category 4+ hurricane to roll in. It hit Bay County very, very hard. It hit the other counties, so there's devastation everywhere. But I think the biggest issue is the magnitude of what the hurricane hit was what was available to our office to be able to do. Our roof had been torn off. If I had to go back and do again, I'd put a shower cap on my server room so it would be protected, but we didn't have that in place. We were under a roof in another story building. You think flood's going to come from the floor, not from the ceiling, but that's what gave us a little more magnitude. Then if you don't have power, communication, cell phone, I mean, even cell phones were down. Even our emergency management center, their radios, the 850 megahertz, the 911 wasn't even functioning for a while. So when you look at the magnitude of the devastation, that's what makes this one a little bit different than all the other pieces. And the fact that it was so direct to me in Bay County, it's had a very direct effect with what we were able to do so close to an election day. We're actually quite fortunate that we at least had 15 days prior to early voting to have hour by hour rebuilding and refurbishing and getting something back up, getting some communication out. Keep in mind, I couldn't even talk to the Division of Elections at the state level. I think it was 3 days before anyone knew exactly what was occurring and what was able to be occurring. And then even after that, email didn't start until October 24th to be reliable. So when you're talking about the messages that are coming from other entities into your office, we didn't even have TV or anything else that everybody was, well, look what happened to Bay County. I saw you on this. Or, you know, we didn't experience any of that because we weren't able to see any of that. So the fact that we thought we were doing a good job, we never knew until we got closer and we were actually starting getting feedback from the public and the news and the other agencies. I think that was the difference in this was the catastrophic conditions of no communication, no power, no basic facilities. People say that it was like a war zone, and I personally have been in some war zones. I can tell you it's worse than a war zone because everybody's personal effects were blown everywhere, roofs and other things being blown off. It really was worse than a war zone. The difference is the magnitude, the speed of which it ramped up. There wasn't a lot of preparation time. And you have your normal emergency plans that you can put into place. But when all of your options, in this emergency, you need to do this. Well, you don't have that. So then when that one fails, you do this. Well, when that one's not there, what do you do? So then it was, okay, what can we do? How do we move forward? What are the first steps? You know, is staff okay? Are their families okay? That was the first step. Then you get to infrastructure. Do I have a building? Do I need to put the roof back on the building to make the rain stop coming into the building? That was the next effect. My equipment, is my equipment damaged? Do I need to get more equipment, or was that good to go? My servers. Then it got into communication, because communication is really the last piece that we actually needed to get in a crisis crunch. You look at what you have available, put what you can into place as far as the COOP plan, and then just attempt to move forward wherever you can, because we were basically on our own little island making the very best decisions with what we had. And the good news is that our office is a quality management system. We have uniformity processes. So when we didn't have that process, we just tried to implement the next process. So we really didn't have to create new processes. We just had to figure out how we could get those processes back online and going as quick as possible. %70 of our polling places were affected one way or another. On the beach side, those polling places did pretty well. That was our positive. Those are where we pulled most of our poll workers and the people to work. On the other side of Panama City, Callaway, Mexico Beach, Lynn Haven, Springfield, Parker, those cities on this side of the bridge, most of their buildings were devastated, or they were being used for emergency purposes. And that's one of the things that I learned in this is you can't always count on buildings that are normally there in an emergency, because others may go in and count on that building for their livelihood to go, we need food, water, shelter, all of those elements. So that's a big piece that gets tied into this hurricane and this emergency condition at this level. You really got to do hour by hour, day by day, and do the very best to physically go around and visit every one of your polling places, because we weren't going to call them. Our poll workers, we literally were going to their houses because we couldn't call them in the beginning, so we were driving wherever we could to get there, and we tell that precinct election official that if you know somebody else and you can get a hold of somebody else, spread the word to get them to get a hold of us, and here's how to do it with an emergency phone line, that we were use an emergency phone that wasn't the normal communication process, to at least open those doors. And the more time that we got, the better off it became. And that's how we successfully were able to get through to making a decision where we need mega sites, not early voting. We just need a mega sites, and we got to vote right on through Election Day. And here's what we're going to do. We have 151 people out of 600. That's how many poll workers we had out of 600 that could actually or even show up here, because a lot of them were displaced. We used email, fax, whatever communication that we could under security and monitoring to get ballots out to people to try to get them back. Very limited number of any kind of email kind of ballots, just because there's not a lot of clarity out there of what everyone's comfortable with. But when it's the only option made available to you, my task is to ensure that voters are able to cast that ballot, and that it's done in a fraud-free way, and that if you need to, security-wise, if you ever ended up in court, that those ballots could actually be identified for the total numbers, and if they wanted to take those numbers back out, they would be able to do that. But I would be adamantly opposed to that kind of behavior, because given the devastation of what we were able to do, I think we should be proud of Bay County, all our precinct election officials. I couldn't have done it. My staff couldn't have done it. It was those 151 people that, even though some of them didn't even have homes, they were living in their mobile homes because their homes were destroyed, were still showing up every day to do that job. That's the strength of democracy in the election. Well, when you talk about a contingency plan, you can look at it, you start down through it, and when none of it exists that rolls to another solution, then you've got to open another playbook and say, okay, what do we have? How can we do it? Can we ensure security? Because, we just went through all the cybersecurity and all the other issues that were going on. Then we also had the Spanish ballot issue being placed on this county. Then we had the hurricane come into place. So we've had lots of different dialogues and conditions that we wouldn't normally have had. So our guard was a little bit up on things that we need to do that we weren't normally doing. We just didn't realize the magnitude that we would have to be creative with security in mind and protection of the voters. And that's basically what we were able to do, is hour by hour figure out what the solutions were. I wish I knew now that the roof was going to come off our building. That'd be one thing I'd like to know, to have known. And the fact that our server room tends to have a slope to where all the wires are coming in, so the concrete tends to slope. So that's where all the water ran on the second floor. When it did hit, it ran into our server room. And I would also like to know that in my server room that it has a physical shower cap. And I call it a shower cap, but I can tell you, very soon we will have a waterproof cover and cap over the top of our server room, so even if it does flood, there'll be channels and a place for water to actually drain down to the floor versus going onto the equipment or another direction. That would have been one of the things that would have made our life a whole lot easier, instead of having to disassemble the servers and put them back together out on the sidewalk after a hurricane. Be prepared to adjust. Be prepared to take a little bit on the chin when things aren't happening the way everybody expects them to. Try to document what you're doing. Try to do your checks and balances, but the media is not necessarily going to understand what's actually happening when it's happening, and be prepared to try to get that clear and get it as positive as soon as you can, because most of it, a lot of it is people just didn't understand what we were doing. And here's the sad thing is the people you're talking with, such as our case in the hurricane, they did not experience what we experienced. Their minds are not where your minds are at. They went home, they had a meal, they showered, they had a restroom to go to, they had all these other things that until you're in the devastation and have gone through these, you just kind of take them for granted. That just put yourself in that environment, and your staff maybe at some point and say, okay, if you don't have this, this, and this, what can you do? And even if that's not available, where do you start? So we're all just one devastation away from experience the same thing each other experience. And I think that's the thing we need to realize is, believe me, I did not volunteer for what myself, my staff, and what my precinct election officials, which we call poll workers, but we call them precinct election officials. It makes them feel better. It's a better title. They like that. But what they did and they experienced, they'll be telling the story forever to their kids, to for everyone. And I think it's an important story to tell, that in a devastation area, a county with 120,000 voters, that we had a 53.1% voter turnout when there are no buildings, there's no water, there's very limited shelter, people are barely getting their lives and making their lives livable. How important democracy is to those voters. I got a real education on how important elections are. One of the main improvements is I've got to go back to our legislation in Florida and is give the county the option of doing a mega site or voting centers, whatever you want to call them, but give us that ability to clearly and understandably, that the law is already there allowing us to have these mobile conditions to where they aren't moved each day, but we have sites that are open and available and don't limit them, because in a devastation, I mean, you can't say, well, yeah, that would have worked, but you can only use this building. Well, that building's not there anymore, so what about this building? Well, no, that's not on the approved list, so you've got to use this building. So that's got to go away. That just simply has to stop. And then the other issue is this issue of the faxing ballots. It's time for us to improve the process and go with technology and look to the future. That my very good friend Paul Lux, he has been pushing this for years prior to me even mentioning this, but we've got to understand that people don't have fax machines anymore, and that's not the premier method to be able to get a ballot back, even from overseas. And I'm not saying that it will be a normal everyday occurrence for people within the county, but in an emergency mode, it sure should be an approved, easily understood and process to be able to take care of those displaced voters the same manner that we would take care of our overseas voters that due to the mail, well, that's the same thing we experienced. Due to the mail was the only reason that the voter was even using that process, because they were displaced, they didn't feel that it could be mailed, they didn't have a fax machine, we tried to get them a fax machine. Those are the dynamics that I probably learned the most on this. We're going to have a shower cap above our servers in our server room. We're going to make it waterproof over the entire area and make that if water does hit it, that it will roll to the side, not into the equipment. The other issue is to understand the dynamics with the poll workers, that there's some pieces that you just can't change to improve because it's all you have available. And in your COOP plan, you will probably put in there, when this has been exhausted, here's your options, and stick to food, shelter, protection, infrastructure, work down, start with people first and get them where they need to be, then infrastructure, and work your way through that process over and over every 30 minutes through the devastation. That probably is the best COOP plan I can come up with, because I won't be able to say, well, if a church that's here, or if a building that's here, or if I can't get into that amount of detail. What you can do is pick those areas, say, focus on these, reassess every hour, get to where you can do a half-day assessment. When you're in a daily assessment, that's good. That life is good when you're in a daily assessment instead of an hourly. When you're in a devastating condition in that manner, number one, you've got safety of the public, you've got health of the public, then you've got physical access to the public, whether they have shelters and all the other pieces. Elections are really not in that list of top priorities, and I understand that, and we really shouldn't be. However, when we do get into these pieces, I as an elected official have got to understand, here's what FEMA's role is, here's what Homeland Security's role is. My role's got to step it up a little bit more, because when it is they've got to take care of life and protect people, whereas I'm going to do an election, and it is important. But again, there's still that point. I shudder to think that if we were to roll back, 7 more days closer to the election day, what would have happened to Bay County? My staff says, no problem, Mark. We would have still got it done. Well, that's probably true, but it would have been a different magnitude, and it would have put a different nuance on how you could accomplish it. The main issue we want to get is clarity on emergency conditions. When you tell me to be creative, and I'm creative, but then the media takes it and puts a different spiel on it, or doesn't quite understand it, it's usually what it is. Or they aren't looking at the positive direction. They like maybe to go a little bit, well, we want to get a little more interest. It's to make sure that when that supervisor makes that decision, maybe there should be minimum criteria. As long as you've got security, what's your security for it? Fraud protection, what's your fraud protection? A line-by-line piece part saying, if you've analyzed these pieces and you, at the bottom, you sign and say, yeah, this is the only way I can get it done, then the state needs to be able to step forward and say, yeah, that was a good process and it was a good method, it was protected, it's understandable, and you move forward. When you get into the dynamics of in Florida, when you have a recount and the governor is making the executive orders or doing the other pieces with discussion with the elections, it creates a whole different dialogue and a whole different partisanships start to come into play, that if they're doing too much for this group versus this group. The awesome thing that we had here in Bay County was the Democratic Party, Republican Party, Libertarian, the Green Party, everybody that was in Bay County, they just wanted people to vote. They didn't get into those elements of who was right and who was wrong. Even my local NAACP and all the other groups, they were all supportive. Unfortunately, when it got outside of the devastation area and the people were all comfortable in their homes or wherever they were staying and they were getting meals and everything in their normal life, they weren't possibly thinking the same way that we were thinking and being forced to think. So I think that's an important thing to realize, that, when it's a devastation, don't try to look at it as a partisan issue. Look at it as, here's what's got to happen, and it's not meant as ever being a partisan issue. We have one in April that's coming up. We've communicated with all the cities. We already know some of their city halls are totally destroyed where we normally vote. So we're talking to them right now how we would do it. I don't know if there's going to be some magnitude of a mega site created with some of these cities that are going to be involved with elections in April. But I also know that I'm going to go to my legislative delegation and inform them that, if I need an emergency management statement made to ensure that I can plan and pull off the presidential preference primary, even though I don't have enough precincts and polling locations, because in our county, the beach side did much better than the other in-town side. Partisan-wise, it's much stronger in one political party versus another political party. So if I can't keep that balance, then I'm going to have the same dynamics that I experienced through this devastation. So we've got to look at, if I can get mega sites to give balance throughout the whole county, I think that's a much smarter way than trying to do a one-day polling location. And in this timeline, I had 6 mega sites, but if I were to roll forward, I would attempt to move it up to 10 mega sites for all of those, the 11 days or 10 days, for 12 hours all the way through those days, and say, here's our election period, here's how we're going to do it. I just need that improvement to be able to move forward from our legislators. Hopefully, my delegation will help us move forward with that.